All right. Um, as I was saying, welcome to the final session of PAMLA and to the second of our two teaching writing across the disciplines sessions. I am very pleased to let everybody know that this, for me, these sessions have been such an important part of my PAMLA experience. And so I'm very happy to let everybody know that after many, many years of running these as a special session and having it become so popular that it became two special sessions, that it will finally be running as a standing session. And this is really all thanks to Shefali. So I think.
Thank you.
Huge.
Yay.
Yeah, huge thank you. All right, I'm gonna let us get started. And our first paper is from Raymond Papica. Raymond Papica is a University Writing Program Associate Director at the University of California in Riverside. He serves as the Writing Across the Curriculum Coordinator and assists various departments and develop and sustain writing intensive interdisciplinary WAC courses.
All right. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Norah, for the introduction. And thank you, Shefali, for inviting me to speak on this panel. I think the last time I was here, I think it was maybe 2019 before everything fell apart. But, you know, I'm glad to be here. I always say, you know, while online conferences always feel odd, it's always uplifting to engage with colleagues during this panel because I always leave learning something new and something that, you know, I can perhaps utilize in my own program. To get things started, I wanted to give us some brief context about UCR's Writing Across the Curriculum program, what we've been doing, you know, how we structure everything to help, you know, shape or pave the way for what I'm going to be talking about. The WAC program here at the University of California, Riverside is in its 13th year, and we are a branch of UCR's University Writing Program. WAC at this time provides support to around 16 WAC courses across 12 departments, including but not limited to physics, anthropology, honors, entomology, chemistry, and engineering. The disciplines I just listed are the most recent to create WAC courses since 2017. But you know what makes the WAC program unique are its moving parts. So let me share my screen briefly. Let me see if I can do this. I am, by the way, managing multiple screens here, so forgive me if things get a little lost in the stream. So I will do this. And hopefully this works. Okay, can you guys see my screen at this point? Okay. So here we are. In terms of how we structure our courses, WAC is ultimately, if I had to sort of put it into a few words, it's collaborative team teaching. So it's a team taught program composed of the following. We have lectures. Normally, these have students anywhere from 100 to maybe 300, give or take. Some WAC courses have around like 20-ish or so if they're upper division science courses. There are discussion sections or lab sections, depending on what course it is. And what makes this, I think, unique above all else are these structured writing workshops and open student-directed Ask Me Anything sessions, which I can talk about in a moment. We also have optional peer writing consultations with an undergraduate tutor who has been trained by the university writing program and who's under my supervision. And in all the complexity, what keeps it all together are these weekly teaching practicums that are used to coordinate all of these moving parts, right? Ultimately, as indicated in that introduction of mine, we work with different instructors to create writing intensive courses, and our WAC courses fulfill either a major or breadth requirement or capstone requirement, including the third quarter writing requirement needed to graduate. But at another level, WAC courses exist to help students become better writers and better critical thinkers. And we want to show students that the writing skills they apply in a WAC course are transferable, regardless of the discipline. So they learn these skills to help them be better communicators and contributors to their own communities, right? Um, and besides the standard lectures, as I've indicated, we do have these supplementary writing workshop series to help students develop their major writing assignments, be it a lab report, research paper, or capstone project. But we also embed undergraduate writing tutors, as I've indicated as well. What we thought about was that we had this structure and we ran into the collision course that was March 2020, which was ultimately the start of the pandemic. And the question ultimately was, how do we take these supporting elements and how do we assist students as they transition very abruptly to the online world, right? And we had the luck of having these writing workshops and these undergraduate tutoring consultations, because at the end of the day, what they ultimately did was they addressed one of our key concerns as instructors, as teachers, which is the concern with time, especially in a quarter system, right? So the workshops and the tutoring options provided additional writing support that students might not be able to receive in lectures or discussion sections, both of which focus primarily on advanced approaches to discipline-specific content. Our writing workshops thus became a much more unique focal point for students as they transitioned into the online world. And so to give you just a sense of scope of where we're at right now, it's fall 2021. We are working with roughly 1,600 undergraduate students. We have 9 university writing program teaching assistants, instructors, 40 TAs across 10 disciplines, 13 instructors, and 7 tutors. And what we wanted to show this evening was to talk a little bit about how the WAC program had to recalibrate to fit with online teaching and the learning environment, and what we are doing now as we transition back to in-person instruction, and possibly even some online instruction in a mostly in-person quarter, which would be winter 2022. When thinking about our teaching experiences in March 2020, we developed new approaches and adapted tried and true strategies specific to a collaborative team taught program. So the pandemic hit us hard, but it forced us to reflect on our own teaching approaches, and it gave us a better understanding of our students and what they go through. Our perceptions change when we realize that students and their siblings are in the background, that they have to turn their cameras off because of other situations outside of their control, right? So as instructors, we ask these following questions, and some of this might look familiar. Perhaps we ask similar questions. So, what are the best practices for making an online course more accessible? What student-friendly and instructor-friendly strategies can we use to streamline the experience, right? How can we reach out to students to show them how to find value in the writing projects in the online world? How can I teach effective writing skills through digital tools with an online environment? Connectivity questions. How can I create an inclusive, encouraging online community between everybody involved, right? How do I reduce student anxiety? This is a big one that we're still running into today, right? When it comes to writing and their educational growth. And then, of course, the sustainability question. What lessons did we learn when crafting pandemic pedagogy? And what can we apply to our in-person courses when we transition back to a fully in-person campus? Learning environment. Oops, missing a word there. And so what we did ultimately, like if I had to boil it down into some aspects of it, successful strategies that we conducted. Oh, hopefully you guys can see this. Let me see if I can zoom in, by the way. There you go. Hopefully that works. So what we wanted to do was create a space where consistent communication, flexibility, become one of our cornerstones, but it also enables us to encourage students to take on writing intensive challenges. And these were the cornerstones for what we did, right? So our successful strategies and workshops and discussion sections. So these are synchronized learning workshops and discussions, I should add. We're creating a time and space for metacognitive writing to reflect on and demystify the writing process. So, and I'll speak actually more on the metacognitive process because it is sort of like the foundation for what I'm talking about today. But we wanted to say, yes, we want to demystify the writing process, but show students that it still requires a process. We were emphasizing the necessity of meaningful feedback and the ability to revise a writing project, and designing a writing intensive workshop where students function more like contributors, puzzle makers, puzzle solvers, rather than just being passive listeners. A lot harder to do in an online environment where sometimes students will, actively just turn their cameras off or mute themselves, and it's hard to tell whether or not they're there, right? Depending on the course and discipline specific objectives, this required a balanced approach that used, as some of you are familiar with, obviously with breakout rooms, small group work. One thing I did want to emphasize here were low stakes and no stakes writing assignments, normally collected in either a group discussion board or my personal favorite, the individual Google Doc journal that pulls together an individual student's writing in one digital document. So the metacognition, free writing, pre-writing, clustering, mapping, listing, outlining, all of it funnels into a singular document that we could technically review at the end of the quarter to see how students improve from the first entry to the very last. We conducted a series of surveys. We continue to do so to encourage student feedback, also part of the metacognitive approach. And as indicated, the Google Doc strategy that yielded positive results, not just for the students, because it made submission so much easier, but for instructors as well, because frankly, it was a lot easier to evaluate student writing when it was all on a singular document, right? Let's see here, I'm scrolling down here. When we applied these during the pandemic, we sought to make writing intensive courses much more accessible and flexible. That was the goal. And these approaches encourage a much more focused approach that doesn't necessarily overwhelm students, but it showed them that as we were planning our transition back to online courses, that we created a manageable writing process that enabled students to approach writing in parts or pieces or puzzle pieces, if you will, so that can be connected to a larger writing project. This allowed us to facilitate more surgically precise revisions through the writing process instead of waiting to submit a final draft and then a revision, right? So while we can't go over a lot of these in full detail with the time that we have, I wanted to give a sense of how metacognition functioned as a catalyst that connected all of these elements together. So one thing that we started to do, because we were collaborating with the instructors as they were designing their lessons, hopefully, can you see this part of it? I'm just verifying because sometimes I wonder. So these are just, in a nutshell, some of the prompts that some of our instructors developed, right? So here, because of our collaborations, instructors wanted students to have more investment in the essays that they were writing, so they incorporated more metacognitive elements to their prompts. So history, for example, students were asked to engage with oral histories and family histories, and they had the opportunity to reflect on the significance of their own family histories. Engineering, students were asked to reflect on why they were passionate about being an engineer. So there was a metacognitive reflection right in the very first 2 weeks of that class. Honors, students are engaging, this is currently right now, engaging with the topic of environmental racism and reflecting on ideas presented by Harriet Washington's A Terrible Thing to Waste, and how it impacts their communities, particularly those in Southern California. Physics, for their capstone paper, students become the teacher and quote unquote teach a specific scientific phenomenon to non-science audiences. And so the idea here is that they reflect on the learning strategies that help them understand that phenomenon. Entomology, students become the teacher also, and they focus on scientific communication. And this one is a really interesting one where students demonstrate how the language of science changes when presented on different platforms. A science journal, for example, like Nature versus a tweet on Twitter. And what happens when the public consumes that information. Students reflect on their own skills to identify faulty information. What do we need to know to detect misinformation? So these are just samples of what some of our WAC courses are currently doing with metacognition. Let's see here. And ultimately, the goal was to create an accessible online environment where students feel validated and have more agency. Students are empowered to claim ownership for their own education and intellectual independence because they can reflect on the processes, the writing processes. And to clarify, we're not just telling students, do whatever you want, but we're saying, students find a way to complete the objectives as designed by the instructor, be it due dates or specific requirements, right? And as we indicated earlier in the previous slide, we wanted to consider students and their circumstances, and we wanted to make them feel more like contributors rather than passive listeners. Or when in Zoom, when they're quiet or faceless and might be inactive because we just don't know, right? And so what this enabled us to do was it enabled us to get a sense of where students were and what they were dealing with when it comes to writing. So just to give you an example of some of the things we found, um, when we were thinking about the communal space where students can engage with each other, the instructor, we noticed that students, here, I will share this. We kind of broke it down here. This is fall 2020's information or data, where we had around 1,600 or 1,200 students, I should say. And 1,200 students clearly needed work on these following elements, right? So they needed assistance with body paragraph development, understanding essay prompts, right? These are out of the students who showed up to our tutoring sessions and our writing workshops. And this enabled us to curate our courses and assist students further with their materials. And for the sake of time here, because I know my time is a little bit short, let's see here. So I can skip this part. This is student feedback. Advantages of what we saw. Okay, so when it comes to metacognition, what we were thinking about was we were building on the ideas of Carol Dweck, but also her protege, David Yeager, as well as other intellectuals such as Ann Curtis as well. But the idea was that, or Stephanie Curtis, I should say, that we wanted students to write feedback about their feedback. So one of the most useful, interesting lessons that we learned was that if we have an open line of communication with students, we would be able to correspond with them, have certain things that we normally might not get from students will be heard at least, or at least seen through the written word, right? So one of the key elements there was that we have students write a metacognitive response about the writing process, their drafting process, but we also ask them to write a metacognitive response based on the feedback that they receive, right? And some advantages that we noticed by increasing the amount of metacognition was that, you know, we had a better sense of what students were doing. So instead of students, one of my biggest anxieties, of course, is that students are, you know, scrolling for their grade or their score rather than looking at the feedback. And so what this enabled us to do was to encourage students to read the feedback, because I would argue that the feedback is much more valuable than the letter grade that they're receiving. Metacognition enables us to have a correspondence with all students, even those who might not participate vocally or who you might not be able to see. Students function more like contributors, as I've indicated. And one of the really cool elements to this was that if writing is a cathartic experience, metacognition allows low stakes writing that could support a positive approach to mental health, with a particular emphasis on having a growth mindset. So their critical thinking skills and writing skills will improve with hard work, repetition, and open communication, right? And just moving forward, some of the biggest takeaways, and I had other things to say, but I think this will sum it up nicely. Metacognition and feedback dynamics facilitate a growth mindset writing process. Metacognition facilitates more student investment. It can be collaborative as well. Students take on challenging writing projects in increments and with low stakes, no stakes that can encourage more student buy-in. And it enables us, in conclusion, to improve our own pedagogy. When students provide commentary and suggestions about a course, when they provide vital commentary about their own writing processes, we can adapt our lessons to enhance the learning environments for both students and the teaching team, right? And so, you know, that's where we were at. And I think it's something that we're going to continue when we go back into the physical space of an in-person classroom or in-person workshop. Oh, and my apologies. I just saw the time, the wrap up indicator. I will wrap up now, and I can continue talking when we have a dialogue. So thank you.
Thank you. Very appreciative, Raymond. And yes, I'm happy to have, let me clap. I think it would be great if we had the discussion at the end. So next we have Vanessa Osborne. Vanessa Osborne is an assistant professor in the writing program at the University of Southern California. She has also been affiliated with USC's Department of American Studies and Ethnicity and the General Education Program. She currently also serves as the writing faculty member for USC's Geographic Information and Spatial Sciences Institute. She has published on Brokeback Mountain, Phineas and Ferb, Sister Carrie, and Depression-era writer Meridel Lesueur. I don't know if I pronounced the name right. Her areas of interest include celebrity, media culture, 20th century American literature, composition pedagogy, and visual rhetoric.
Hi, sorry, I was adjusting my standing desk and I thought I had my camera off, so I apologize if I was distracting to everyone. I was like, I think I want to present standing up. It feels nice, but I don't have shoes on, so we'll leave that, unprofessional detail out. So I have a paper that I prepared because I know that if I just had slides, I would go long over and ramble a little bit. So what I did though, thinking about online pedagogy, one of the things I really built into when we were exclusively online are these sort of visual checks. So I thought that it was important to just have an outline here to keep people kind of connected. Otherwise, I think, it's hard, I think, to just listen online without getting distracted. So hopefully I'm able to leave you guys on this screen and just pull up my paper. Now, do you still have that outline? Norah, do you still have that? Okay, perfect. And now I'm going to make myself disappear so I don't watch myself present. 1 second, it's just going to mute my video. Mute my video. Hide selfie, that's what it is. All right. Many students in terminal master's degree programs face a writing challenge. Their master's thesis falls very much under the purview of academic writing, with all the conventions of academic discourse. But the overwhelming majority of them have no desire or interest in pursuing an academic career. They occupy, in a sense, a liminal role, negotiating the role of student, academic, and professional, while sometimes simultaneously as they continue to pursue higher education to make them more marketable and employable, often while working full-time jobs. This student community is under-discussed in the research on writing and rhetoric. This paper will identify where this population fits into the discourse on graduate student writing training and describe the transdisciplinary work I've done over the past 6 years with USC's spatial science master's degree students, emphasizing how I highlight and embody audience as a core strategy in working with this population. Much of the discussion on graduate student writing instruction rightfully diagnoses the larger academic community's lack of attention to how graduate students build the habits, knowledge, and self-conceptualization as writers in their discipline. In response, in 2013, the National Science Foundation and the Council of Graduate Schools together called for STEM graduate programs to, quote, incorporate communication skills into their curriculum. And even as early as 2001, in their call for the teaching of writing in graduate education, Rose and McCaffrey recognized that writing, despite being a key skill for graduate and postgraduate school success, is rarely explicitly taught in graduate programs. Students must understand, quote, the genre conventions that members of the disciplinary community employ, because, quote, without this knowledge, students remain locked outside the community's discourse. This statement, like much of the literature on this topic, identifies graduate students as transitioning into a disciplinary community as future academics. And most scholars on the topic attend to doctoral students who must plan for a lifetime of writing according to the codes and conventions of their discipline. But what of the many terminal master's degree students who must produce an academic master's thesis, but who do not plan further academic work after graduation? To many of these students, writing can feel like an obstacle to surmount, full of mysterious conventions and empty formulas. Moreover, much of the writing education that takes place for graduate students takes up a dispiriting deficit framing. In response to the increased accessibility of graduate school and more linguistically diverse student cohorts, graduate advisors tend to focus on what these students lack. Proper grammar and syntax serve as the most easily recognized and obvious challenge. A limited understanding of the writing process, as well as the added anxiety that the deficit model fuels between advisors and advisees, often leads grad students to an even more fraught relationship to writing. In response, many writing scholars propose we shift from the apprenticeship model that characterizes much of graduate school writing instruction and focus instead on supportive writing classes and writing center interventions. My work, while retaining a model of individual and personal engagement, aims to facilitate an understanding of the writing process and conventions and build my students' scholarly identity in a supportive, process-oriented dynamic. USC's Master in Spatial Sciences program, an almost exclusively online program, enrolls a truly diverse cohort. Many of them are working professionals. Some have recently graduated from a science-oriented undergraduate program, while others have been away from a school environment for some time. Most are in the United States, but some are abroad, working, or in the military. Nevertheless, they come into a program that requires a writing-intensive master's thesis, possessing a wide variety of experience when it comes to writing. For this reason, the Spatial Science program has reached across campus to establish a partnership with the writing program and appoint me as the writing specialist within their program. I'd like to briefly explain spatial sciences to those who, like myself 6 years ago, have no clue what spatial sciences comprises. Spatial science is a multidisciplinary field of study that integrates spatial thinking, tools like mapping, GPS, GIS, and satellite imaging in order to address, assess, and respond to challenges in the physical world. Spatial science and GIS projects come from many distinct academic paths, many from geography, geology, and environmental studies, but other students come from international relations, urban planning, business, emergency management, real estate, or military backgrounds. Most, but not all of the spatial science students I work with see themselves as working in a STEM tradition and often have a somewhat fraught relationship to writing, feeling like it isn't their specialty or that it's particularly a challenging activity for them. While most of them have felt confident enough writing in shorter or more technical papers for their coursework, for many, the master's thesis feels daunting. My intervention comes during the first half of a 2-semester-long prospectus to thesis course that culminates in students filing and defending their MA thesis. The professor of the thesis class introduces me to the students, and I work with them for the remainder of the semester, commenting on drafts and meeting with them one-on-one as they write preliminary drafts of the chapters. For the purpose of this talk, I'm going to limit what I talk about and discuss how I emphasize audience as a crucial component in aiding these students in their transition from student to scholar. In my early conversations establishing my role with spatial science faculty, we discussed the experience that I came to as a reader with writing expertise, but someone who's outside the discipline of spatial sciences. The Spatial Sciences Administration posited that they wanted their students to be understandable by a committed, engaged, non-specialist reader. As spatial sciences tends to transcend disciplinary boundaries, this makes sense, and it's one I explicitly invoke when first introduced to the students. Moreover, many of these projects do go on to be read by stakeholders outside of the academic department in which they're produced. Students' projects may sometimes be read by their employers, city and government officials, or nonprofit groups. But as I've worked with the program over the years, my role has deepened. I've read in draft form the majority of the master's thesis projects produced for the program. I can, via memory and a quick computer search through my files, refer them to projects that approach the same subject area or methodology. For example, this semester I have a student who's researching ideal outdoor locations for encampments for the unhoused population in Long Beach, California. I'm able to refer him to a project produced 2 semesters ago that worked with the Los Angeles Homeless Service Authorities to identify and count unhoused residents. In my work with students, I take on 2 distinct audience roles. One is a writing specialist, identifying patterns of grammar errors, discussing organizational strategies and conventions of writing in the discipline. But I also take on the role of a prospective reader, asking questions, offering suggestions, and pointing out what makes me curious and what makes me puzzled. In this role, I am best able to demystify the writing process and the conventions of academic writing. Via my reader role, I emphasize how writing reveals their work to an audience and contributes to an ongoing disciplinary conversation. I emphasize how a reader might approach the work differently, Unlike their advisor, who reads a project in its entirety with a clear conception of the project, a future reader might only read a lit review chapter, hoping to glean some information or source for their own work. For that reason, students must provide context to a reader who would not have read the introduction and understand the overall project trajectory. Moreover, this attention to the different reasons readers may read the text emphasizes the importance of proper formatting. For many students, these attributes still feel like obligatory hoops to jump through, but with an attention to the future reader, my students understand the responsibility and rationale for these in-text and works cited citations. In addition to demystifying the mechanical conventions, I contribute most significantly by helping students reframe their introductions and thus contextualize their work. Many of them struggle with the introduction and motivation section of the project. In some way, this struggle makes particular sense to students in a terminal master's program. The motivation for producing their master's thesis seems self-evident: to complete the project in order to get the degree, and get a raise, a better job, more responsibility, or to demonstrate the technical skills they've added to their resume. Consequently, they struggle with this section of the document. Often these sections become preoccupied with the project for its own sake instead of recognizing the context of their work. For example, a student may describe a project mapping the New Jersey coast before and after Superstorm Sandy. They may, in their introduction, focus on the spatial science tools and methods their project utilizes as a way to demonstrate and show off what they've learned in their program. My intervention urges them to remember the broader academic community they're contributing to and the multiplicity of different readers who may encounter their work. How, for example, their work speaks to issues of emergency management, global climate change, urban planning, and even socioeconomic class. My status as an external reader stands in for other external readers whose interests lie beyond a demonstration of spatial science skills, who want to understand how this kind of research or method speaks to important environmental problems or social issues. While my reading as a committed, engaged, non-specialist reader can help them contextualize their work as a contribution to academic discourse, my reading as a writing professor focuses on effective communication, emphasizing how to make their work clear and well-structured to maximize reader understanding. To this end, I focus on topic sentences, transitions, and precision in language. My work continuously focuses how a reader approaches and understands a text in order to prompt students to leave behind writing as expression and the writer-based prose that characterizes it. For the most part, this work emphasizes process and the reader-writer transaction and de-emphasizes grammar and mechanics for their own sake. While I do point out patterns of grammar errors, I do so in a low-pressure environment, one that is wholly supportive as I coach and encourage, but never assign a grade. Grammar and syntax tends to be a low priority when it comes to my interventions into my advisees' writing process. Line editing would be futile as the pages they submit to me will be revised. My work with the students has a built-in emphasis on revision. I work with the students the semester before they submit their final chapters. Thus, any work on polishing or line editing their work would be fruitless, as many of the individual sentences change as the work progresses. But grammar and syntax specifically bring me to one of the most prominent challenges in working collaboratively across the disciplines. Many of the faculty members in SSI don't quite know what we do in a writing program. Being well aware of my audience at the conference, I probably don't have to tell you that those unfamiliar with writing programs sometimes imagine we're all rigorous grammarians drilling students on verb tenses and the intricacies of commas. Periodically, I get an email or two from students and faculty alike, typically asking for urgent copy editing or proofreading. Sometimes I get questions about how to deal with a particularly challenging Microsoft Word formatting issue. To all these requests, I explain my role with the program and refer them to someone who can help, either a professional academic editor or tech support. Another challenge I encounter comprises establishing rapport and credibility without any classroom teaching engagement. This challenge can afflict anyone working transdisciplinarily. To this end, I've developed a narrative that identifies my credentials in writing and argumentation, establishes the importance of the non-specialist reader, and then tell them my story of moving from initial ignorance and puzzlement about spatial sciences into knowledge and expertise via years and years of reading and commenting on MA theses. But while establishing my expertise is important, I also recognize where mine ends and theirs begins. In her lit review on research on graduate student writing instruction in library and informational science, Anita Andrusuk identifies that even the most constructive feedback challenges a student's confidence and sense of self. Recognizing this fragile dynamic, I cede authority to my students on matters where they have expertise and I don't. Methods, complex technical concepts, and elaborate formulas that contain Greek letters and mysterious variables. While this presentation briefly touches upon the transdisciplinary work I do with grad students, I hope my work can inspire more research and thinking from writing and rhetoric faculty on just how we can serve students in terminal master's programs. The apprenticeship model that characterizes much graduate student writing instruction seems insufficient to those who are not apprentices, but are rather practitioners and professionals in their own fields. And I hope we can build programs and structures to recognize their expertise and aid them in communicating it. Thank you.
Thank you. That was terrific. Okay. Our next presenter is Erin Banks. Erin Banks is the director of first-year writing at La Sierra University, a small private Christian Hispanic serving university in Riverside, California. In addition to overseeing the first-year writing courses, she teaches and trains master's students teaching in first-year writing classes, and she's also the chair of the Writing and Rhetoric Across the Curriculum Committee.
All right, thank you. I'm gonna try this screen sharing thing everybody's been doing, hopefully. Okay. So, like my bio said, I primarily am in charge of the first year writing program, which is an entire job in and of itself. But something that I have found at many of the conferences I've gone to at CES and CWPA, especially, are many others in my position at small schools where we have to tackle things that weren't necessarily part of our original job description, just by nature of being the only person in that area on that campus. So what I'm providing today is a bit of a narrative of me working through revitalizing a writing in the disciplines program with what I had available to me, using a recent publication as kind of my guiding, my guidebook. So I, like the previous speaker, wrote it out so that I can stay focused here. So, all right. So my title here is Sustainable WAC in Unsustainable Times, Revitalizing a Writing in the Disciplines Program in a Time of Unprecedented Challenges. In March of 2017, 2 consultant evaluators from the Council of Writing Program Administrators visited my campus and assessed the writing, leaving me as the only WPA with a list of 11 recommendations. These recommendations range from getting more release time to help with my administrative commitments to revising our basic English curriculum completely. 2 of the 11 recommendations centered on the lack of a clear writing across the curriculum presence and included recommendations to both develop a writing across the curriculum program and to hire or appoint a director of writing across the curriculum, 2 rather large tasks. I was hired in 2015 to direct the college writing program, which includes overseeing the first year writing sequence, as well as supervising and training the graduate teaching assistants who serve as the primary instructor pool for these classes. In the 6 years since my hiring, my job description has grown. As the one who initiated the consultant evaluator visit, as well as being the only WPA or RecComp trained person on campus, I was tasked with the list that the consultant evaluators left for the English department. And since this list was shared with the provost, deans, and chair of my department, I knew I needed to take action and begin chipping away at it. La Sierra University is a small, private Christian Hispanic serving university in Riverside, California. A large part of our student population comes to our school to obtain their prerequisite requirements for professional schools, such as medical or nursing school. Because of this, much of our curriculum is geared toward the STEM fields. We also have large programs in business, psychology, social work, and health and exercise science. The 11 recommendations I received from the CWPA consultant evaluators provided me with a useful map to guide the first several years at my university. In short, they helped me understand what my priorities should be. I chipped away and revamped our basic English program, worked on a digital badge and teaching composition for our graduate students, and made some recommended curricular changes. Throughout these efforts, I started having important conversations with the Dean of General Education about what could be done to help improve writing across campus, laying the groundwork for a WAC focus of some kind. Through these conversations, I learned that we already had a list of courses in our course bulletin considered upper division rhetoric intensive that met a general education requirement. This was something that had not been shared with me until a few years into my time at my university. This requirement had been created in the early 2000s, and a rhetoric across the curriculum committee had been meeting regularly to vet these courses against criteria that had been created a few years earlier. Over the years, the committee stopped meeting and the approval and oversight for the UDRE courses had been handed over to another committee. The GE Dean shared these requirements with me, and it appeared upon first glance that they were fairly broad and easy to meet. In other conversations I started having about the recommendations regarding WAC, it was made clear from administrators that hiring or appointing someone as a WAC director was not possible due to budgetary constraints, making it clear that if a change were going to happen in this area, or even a small move toward meeting the recommendations regarding WAC, it was going to be on me to do so. So I did what every good WPA does. I signed up for a workshop. At the 2017 College Composition and Communication Conference, I attended a day-long workshop led by Michelle Cox, Jeffrey Gallen, and Dan Melzer on creating a sustainable writing across the curriculum program. The day was packed with helpful concepts, useful strategies, and ideas I hadn't considered. However, what became pretty clear rather quickly was that the lack of funds at my institution would mean that most of what these experts recommended wasn't going to be possible. After the day finished, I took my pages of notes back to my hotel room and began to map out what I could make use of from the workshop within my many constraints, including the load I was already carrying as the WPA for the first year writing program. Cox, Gallen, and Melzer's approach is built around what they have coined the whole systems approach. The book they published the year after I attended their workshop is titled Sustainable WAC, A Whole Systems Approach to Launching and Developing Writing Across the Curriculum Programs. They spend a great deal of time in the book presenting several different systems theory frameworks, which to me and my shoestring budget and skeleton crew felt a bit daunting. However, on the most basic level, Cox, Gallen, and Melzer recommend 4 steps through the process of creating a sustainable WAC program: understanding the institutional landscape, planning a program, developing a project, and making reforms, and leading for sustainability. The first step is one that I had begun before the workshop through my conversations with the GE Dean and planting the scene in those conversations that the current rhetoric intensive procedure requirements were a bit disappointing. This led her to resurrect the old rhetoric across the curriculum committee that was still in our faculty handbook as an official committee. She then asked for my input as she populated it, allowing me to include those across campus I knew were open to talking about writing and were supportive of focusing on writing more in their own classes. Within the first recommendation to understand the institutional landscape are 3 strategies. Determine the campus mood, understand the system in order to focus on points or interactivity and leverage, understand the ideologies and inform the campus culture of writing. With these in mind, I set out to learn as much as I could about how writing was taught across campus, what other professors thought about writing, what their expectations were, and what they might be willing to do to improve student writing. Through these conversations, I was also building important bridges between myself and departments and helping them begin to see me as a relative newbie to campus, as someone who wanted to help them in this area and had the know-how to do so. This work took about a year to complete. The RAC committee met regularly, starting with discussions more theoretical than practical, such as really thinking about what is writing's purpose in higher education. And then we moved on to really looking at the current requirements for the UDRE courses. The committee, knowing that no one had been keeping track of the requirements and the quality of courses offered for some time, performed an audit of the courses against the current requirements. We ultimately discovered that most of the courses currently listed in the bulletin were barely meeting the former requirements that we all agreed were pretty easy to meet. While this work happened, I, with the blessing of the committee, went to various faculty meetings on campus to ask about writing in their major concerns, and what they would like to see for the future of writing on our campus. I also sent out a survey to all faculty to get some of these questions answered, as well as more specifics about what kind of writing they required. After a year of this, the committee and I had a pretty good idea of where the campus was in terms of writing across the curriculum. The next stage in the methodology is planning a program. Fortunately for me, planning did not have to happen from scratch, or rather I knew it wasn't possible to plan from nothing given our budget issues and my time constraints, so it made the most sense to pursue revitalizing what was already in our handbook and bulletin. We had UDRE courses and a committee, so the task instead turned to making sure that what we had on record was doing what we wanted it to do. And we knew from the audit of the course materials that this was not the case for most of the classes currently listed. Once we reached the stage, the general education dean position had changed hands, and as part of the transition, the committee voted to have me chair the RAC committee as we move forward. This worked well for this part of the process as it established, albeit small, a sense of ownership and authority for my next steps in the process as I worked with professors across campus. With our audit done and our realization that the former guidelines were not rigorous enough to get the results we wanted, we set out to revise the major requirements for the UDRE courses. We looked at several other schools' guidelines to help us, and because of the discipline-specific nature of what we had seen in many of the syllabi we looked at, we opted to emphasize writing and the writing process, but to leave the parameters and genres of assignments completely up to the instructors, allowing for more flexibility for the sciences. At this point, we moved into the third stage, developing projects and making reforms. Once our guidelines were set, I began to function as the PR person for these changes. I started by going to the major faculty meetings on campus, including college and school meetings and faculty senate. These are not always friendly audiences. I was giving them more work, so I tried to maintain a message of helpfulness and sharing a common goal. I used the results of my survey to make sure to frame the changes we wanted to make as ones they had indicated needed attention in their survey responses. I made promises about support for faculty as they went through the process, including workshops and one-on-one meetings, which seemed to help them feel support would be available enough to tackle this task. And then COVID-19 hit and everything shifted. As we all know, we shifted to online communication and meetings for every part of our academic lives. The RAC committee adapted quickly, a testament to the investment of my faculty members, and we transitioned to Zoom and recalibrated. We quickly realized that our original plan to host workshops on proposal writing, planning effective classroom writing activities, and teaching writing strategies was not going to be possible in the way we originally envisioned. We played around with the idea of having Zoom workshops, but people were Zoomed out. Instead, with the support of the RAC committee, I crafted 2 different websites. First, I created a website content hosted on the GE Dean's webpage with general writing teaching tips, with everything from rubrics and grading strategies to PowerPoints instructors could borrow to teach organization, thesis development, and the like. The second website is an internally accessed Google site with a video talking through the new UDRE guidelines, a sample proposal from an early submitter, the rubric used to assess proposals, and a Google form to fill out to ask for more help. We are currently accepting proposals and moving through the approval process throughout the school year. Our original deadline was last March for proposals, but given the stressors of the last 2 years, we decided to extend our deadline for a year to give more time for those revisions to occur. Success is on the horizon. We have received a number of excellent proposals. Instructors are using strategies like peer review, reflective writing to tap into metacognition, and integrating writing as a major outcome to these courses when before it seemed like an afterthought. Most encouraging is the sense of ownership they are starting to feel over teaching writing in their classes instead of merely assigning it. This process has opened up communication about writing expectations, grading strategies, as well as how the first-year writing sequence is preparing students for writing in classes across campus. As we finalize the newly approved courses this spring, we will move into stage 4, which is leading for sustainability. Cox, Galen, and Melzer recommend regular communication to keep the program visible in this phase, as well as assessing and revising the program on a regular basis. As I consider other responsibilities for myself and my load, it is likely I'll have to hand the chairship of this committee off to someone else in the future. Before that day comes, my task will be to continue to do outreach across campus on the hows and whys of writing instruction. Cox, Galen, and Melzer say that a major reason for their book and their approach is the tendency of WAC programs to flounder or die from neglect over time. This was nearly the case for my own program 5 years ago. They argue that a WAC program that never moves beyond the micro level work is difficult to sustain and may never get to the tipping point where it has a transformative effect on the campus culture of writing. From the conversations I had and survey results I received, it is clear that the writing culture on my campus could use a boost. This will mean a continued effort by the RAC committee to support the teaching of writing and emphasizing its value on an ongoing basis. As I look back on what has been achieved over the last 5 years, the major takeaways from the whole systems approach proposed by Cox, Melzer, and Gallen that worked for my small school, small team, and limited funds include involving multiple stakeholders in the system, determining the campus mood, and planning for gradual rather than rapid reforms to the system. From my own experience, I would also make 2 additional suggestions to the major strategies offered: consistent and enthusiastic messaging and communication, and building relationships and finding allies. These 2 factors were vital to my work on my small campus, where some departments only have 2 or 3 members. I needed buy-in quickly, so relationships and positive messagings were vital. The fact that I am the only WPA and my main responsibility as the first-year writing program was a fact that kept me focused on getting others to see the value of what we sought to do and motivated me to reach out to those who had shared the vision of better writing and understand that it is our shared responsibility that we support students in becoming effective writers. Sustainability for my revised program will mean continually circling around on an annual or biannual basis to reemphasize the importance and value of writing in non-English courses and the care that their successful delivery requires. We have also built in a regular 3-year review for each course. But beyond a watchful eye, a shared investment, one that is forming through this process, will be the key to long-term success. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. This has been, these are really, really great. And I love how well all of these presentations are really speaking to each other and to like shared issues and concerns. So this is awesome. Let me trash that before we, okay, awesome. Let me introduce our last speaker. Tracy Ovell Parks is a high school composition instructor at a public charter school in Southern California, whose research focuses on the impact pedagogy has on composition. She's a doctoral candidate in the Leadership and Educational Justice program at the University of Redlands. When she has spare time, she likes to adjunct at local community colleges. All right, Tracy.
I was trying to, hi everyone, thanks for sticking around. I was trying to get rid of the captions in the bottom, but I'm not going to be able to do it, so I'm not going to pay attention to it, okay? All right, so my paper is entitled Carnival Classrooms, Sites of Resistance in Secondary Composition Classrooms. These photos, just so you know, come from me and some of my trips in order to kind of come up with this paper. So my presentation is proposing a dissertation study that explores the impact that pedagogy, carnival pedagogy, and mentoring strategies are in creating a classroom space where students can freely express views that encourage or liberate critical thinking skills, useful in understanding and composing written works following California standards. I wanted to give you a little bit about why this project. Except for my first year of teaching, I've largely taught marginalized students from Title I schools. I'm currently at a public charter school teaching composition classes. Before COVID, I had an opportunity to study a semester in Cuba. And so I got a chance to experience lectures from various professors, walk in and see classrooms. And this photo is of a first grade classroom that really impressed me. The first graders were writing in cursive better than the adults that were standing in the room. And they were very much interested in pedagogy. Their teachers went to the students rather than the students going from room to room. So I thought that was really interesting and most definitely different than what I'm used to. So for me, I'm looking for figuring out ways to try and help my students, especially my marginalized ones, well, all students really, to resist status quo norms, because the classroom that I hope to create supports this. So for me, educators must teach all students, especially the most marginalized. And I really like to teach them that, I give them a little bit of theory, and I tell them that, their labor is arguably something that can give them a little bit of economic security. And graduating from high school is the first step in achieving some sort of economic independence, at least if you're in high school. Yet from my experience of teaching at all levels of school, collaborative planning sessions between teachers doesn't generally focus on pedagogical practices, and teachers are kind of often left in solitude to sort of figure it out, or maybe that's been my experience. So a little bit more background on my public charter school. My students come to our school for the purpose of credit recovery. We are all certified teachers. We offer teaching that follows the state standards, but we have students that have been pushed out from other schools, either their own doing or some other personality conflict or health issues. And so these students basically walk into my classroom, see a woman with gray hair, and kind of expect the status quo from teaching as well. And so I try to quickly change that outlook with them for me, because once I can get them to buy into the program, it's a little bit easier for them to graduate. And by getting used to the program, I'm really meaning that it's an independent program. Students work mostly on their own, but we have decided that at our site, we needed our students to have some direct instruction. And so there is a certain pace that students are supposed to meet in order to graduate on time or to return to their previous schools. And so if I don't get them producing work quickly, then they could be basically dropped from the program because they would be truant. And so let's see here. So for me, what I've noticed is that education can kind of seem like a carnival. Marginalized students such as Black, Indigenous, and people of color, LGBTQ students, students with disabilities. I have homeless students and students in foster care, and they find that the current educational system does not support their efforts in achieving a diploma, and often feel that their efforts are undermined. So I feel like not only supporting student identity and helping students develop a sense of agency through mentoring and social emotional learning practices, I'm hoping to develop them a little bit better into stronger students, ones who are willing to stick with me so that they will graduate. So a little bit of background, I'm looking at Bakhteen's Carnival, and he suggests that there are 4 types of norms in a carnival setting, that people of all levels of society can interact, that the unconventional behavior that was otherwise unacceptable is permitted during the carnival, that the accessible and familiar attitude of the carnival enables everything which is separate to connect, such as social hierarchy, and that the carnival is a site of ungodliness, of blasphemy, profanity, or parodies on things that are sacred. So I'm working on my interpretation of these 4 pieces, and I'll try to briefly kind of explain what I'm looking at. So for my setting, I want everyone to have equal say on what topics students get to participate in collaborative learning project settings. And I want them to work on these projects, depending upon which one they choose, for either a unit or a couple of units, or maybe as part of the entire semester of projects. So again, I'm still kind of working on these things. For the second point, where unconventional behavior is seen as acceptable as a means of communicating, I wanted to make sure that my students understood that safety, kindness, respect, all of those rules were still expectations, and expectations that can't be broken, but they might be a little bit different in the way that they try to communicate with others in the classroom. It could be a little bit more noisy. My classrooms are a little bit more noisier and seemingly carnival-like. So I'm trying to figure out how I can get students on board and get them willing to try and participate in writing. So the fourth aspect, the sight of ungodliness, of blasphemy, I'm really kind of trying to interpret that as using a variety of texts from Dr. Seuss books, films, song lyrics, pop culture, and most especially politics and community activism, to educate my students on current events and issues that are affecting them at local, state, and national levels. And so again, this has been hard trying to get them to buy in. And so for Bakhtin, the carnival space was confined in time, but not in space, meaning that the carnival did not simply exist in a town square, but in the neighborhoods of the carnival sites. And I think schools are very much a part of that. They exist in neighborhoods. There are activities that go on. Lots of community involvement occurs here. It is a community center. But I think that the carnival that exists really outside the carnival space, excuse me. And I think it becomes more intriguing, the space becomes more intriguing when students are connected using smartphones. And so for me, watching this past year, trying to get students to leave their cameras on, trying to allow them to leave them off, being mute, trying anything I could get them to buy into the program, to participate, has been very difficult. And again, I think smartphones sort of make us exist in the carnival, whether we want to or not. At least that's the way it seems sometimes to me. I think that using the carnival pedagogy will allow students to dialogue with each other, since everyone is considered the learner as well as myself. I want to teach students to evaluate sources to help them support their viewpoints. That helps them also to participate in society. What I've learned the past year through the last election and whatnot, with my seniors especially, is that they're reticent to participate. They are nervous. They don't want to seem like they don't know what they're doing. And of course they won't, but they're too scared to actually walk in and participate. So I spent this past year talking about political issues, talking about fake news versus real news, and trying to figure out how I can lead them to better sources so that they could then write the assignments that I'm giving them, and understand the concepts as well. So, oops, I think there we go. So again, this part is under construction. I've added this dialogic mentoring because I've seen it pop up in many studies. And I won't really read the slide. I'm thinking that it might be too many things for a doctoral dissertation. So looking at pedagogy and social emotional development as being very important in trying to get participation and getting students to write something and participate in the classroom has been the bigger challenge. So I'm not quite certain about this dialogic mentoring piece, because I feel like what I'm doing with social emotional learning and activities and discussions is not really a dialogic mentoring strategy. So that part is really something that I'm working on, but I thought I would include it here. I think the significance of this study is that education obviously both perpetuates and improves society. I think teachers can enhance classroom instruction by confronting biases, trying to heal wounds created by those biases, and transgressing traditional boundaries of authority and influence to transform classrooms into sites of liberation. Excuse me. Using that carnival pedagogy, hopefully we'll create a collaborative involvement and learning projects so that we can have conversations to activate background knowledge, which would hopefully inspire further dialogue, and then strengthening their understanding by giving them reflective writing projects, sometimes with prompts based on the novel or the article or the topic that we're studying, or based on the project that we're working on. So a couple of the things that I've learned as well by looking at a few theorists and scholars like Dr. Timothy Lensmeyer, So I've highlighted my positionality and my limitations because I won't be able to, I believe, fully examine them in the course of a study. So my positions and limitations, excuse me, as a composition instructor of marginalized high school students, discussions and prompts help my students understand how writers persuade, argue, and inform readers. Class discussions and readings will often center around politics, race, news, and current events, and I'll use a variety of literature that I've already mentioned. So for me, I want to do this to disrupt ways that white supremacy and patriarchy impact learning, and I'd like to make fundamental changes to how those in power view race. So exploring how white teachers impact learning and teaching will not be investigated at this time. Instead, I hope to examine the implications of creating a classroom space to enable students to feel safe enough to share, to resist status quo culture, maybe to liberate new ways of thinking and being. So I was looking at my questions, my research questions, and the first one, which I thought was going to be acceptable. Again, this is a work under progress in construction. And so this idea of how effective, excuse me, is using a Carnival pedagogy at creating classroom composition spaces where social, economic, and institutional issues are examined from the perspective of marginalized students. So that part about how effective or how I'm going to be measuring what is effective is another sticking point. So working on some of the language here for the questions, but I'm really wanting to figure out how I can get my students who have already been pushed out of one system to trust me enough to try to write and do the assignments that I give them as a means of getting them closer to graduating. So that's really the significance in the questions. And that's really all that I needed to express to you today. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. So yeah, I want to thank everybody who has presented, and I really appreciate the questions that you have sort of like given us to kind of guide some of the conversation and discussion. I'm gonna open it up now to if anybody has a question, and I think we can all see everybody on the screen, so I'm gonna say feel free, speak up. You don't have to raise your hand, and we can just like respect and not talk over each other.
It's the same, isn't that same Zoom silence of the classroom, right, where you ask the question? I call it the eternal Zoom silence. We can have some fun with it. It's good to see everyone here. Several colleagues, and also Ray, who I used to work with at UCR. How's it going, Ray? Nice to see you. I think it's been a few years. And then some colleagues here as well. So yeah, I think, Ray, I was, because the WAC program is I think really well developed, and I never got a chance. I was on my way out of the PhD program, and I think at the time only the business was available, or there were slots open. You had the physics, which I was interested in. It sounded so productive. I think also Shafali mentioned in the chat something about the feedback on feedback, or the feedback about feedback, which is something I'm trying to do more with my students, because like you said, I think there's a real concern about when we give feedback as faculty of, as you mentioned, them kind of scrolling on for the grade. And so I've been trying to elicit more feedback from them about the feedback that I give them. I mean, in our student evaluations, we have a question on instructor feedback, right? And so I kind of mentioned that to them, and I mentioned that as an opportunity to send me feedback about my own feedback throughout the semester. I was wondering how you specifically kind of ask them to do that, or how you kind of orient them in giving that kind of feedback?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great to see you again, Ryan, in the void of Zoom, as you put it. So one of our concerns when we entered into the pandemic in March 2020 was that we noticed that, or the fear really was that students might not be as active in the online community as opposed to the in-person community. And we noticed that we started to initiate these really low stakes, simple Google Forms as a sort of, think of it as a sort of a pre-writing or pre-workshop kind of assignment, if you will, or something to be done in lieu of an icebreaker, where we ask students in that form, what are the struggles you have when it comes to writing, or what do you find challenging when it comes to writing or reading? And that was like our first iteration of it, right? We noticed now, as in today, like even now, we're having a dialogue about this in our history class, because we're asking students to openly communicate, and we ourselves as instructors are being transparent. A lot of the students are more willing to say what's actually on their mind. And so in two cases, or actually just a handful of these, students either said they felt embarrassed that they were asked to revise a paper. They felt like they were, quote unquote, being reprimanded because one, they probably never had the experience of the revision process, right? So I think a lot of students coming into the university were thinking, okay, you write a paper, you submit it, you get a grade, done. And what we wanted to do was facilitate an environment where we can say, you're going to write a paper, or better yet, you're going to write parts of your paper, get continuous feedback either through the writing workshops, through peer consultations, office hours, consultation hours, just providing them a slew of accessible points depending on their style. And we thought that we could help facilitate a point where we can say, well, based on the feedback you're getting, what can you do next to improve maybe this paragraph? Or, if they submit the entire like 5-page essay, we'll ask them, okay, based on the feedback you're getting, what are the next steps, or what's an action item list based on the comments in the margins that you can use to build your next paper? And it was as simple as either a Google form, or we asked them directly, just a simple question, based on the feedback, what are you going to do next? It's basically the now what question. And we wanted to do that two ways. When they submit a paper, they write a metacognitive reflection about their processes. Then they wait for the feedback to appear. And then the next step is to then write about the feedback, right? And so that helped facilitate, I think, more trust amongst the students. And it encouraged more buy-in. I think that's one of some of the terms that we were sharing. I think Aaron mentioned it. Tracy, you mentioned it as well. And it was one of those puzzles really that we were trying to solve. But just a long story short, yeah, it was more about encouraging students to respond. And the cool thing about it too was that they could respond through a Google form, through a discussion board. But a lot of times it was just facilitating a conversation or a correspondence with the instructor or myself and the student, so that even if I didn't get a chance to see them online, there was still this written communication between me and that particular student. And I thought it was a very refreshing maneuver that we then applied to a lot of our WAC courses. So as you saw in one of those slides, they started to incorporate it in our history courses, engineering courses, and it functioned more as a suggestion as well. So yeah, but it is something that I would suggest moving forward. It made me a better instructor. I think it made for a better learning environment, and not just in the not in the online environment, but I think it's something that can be replicated easily in an in-person class as well.
Yeah, I found that I shifted in the pandemic. I integrated so much more reflection and metacognition, just so students could distinguish, they're sitting at a desk the whole time in the same space. What are they learning here? What are they gaining from this class? And I'll just share briefly what I did. We also do a contract graded class. And so in a way, it's all feedback. There's no scrolling for a grade because there is no grade. But what I wanted to do before the main assignment, the last assignment that really matters, that they do actually get a grade on, is sort of this, choose 3 of the primary critiques, assess it. Can it be addressed with better invention, analysis, structure, or style? And then how might you avoid this problem or address this, weakness in future papers? I think I'll change that word weakness. I now I don't like it in retrospect, but it's fairly straightforward. And I was concerned that they weren't going through and looking at the feedback, and I think that undercuts a lot of what I do with contract grading. So I needed to kind of create something. I'll be introducing this next week in my class as we shift into that paper that does get graded.
Wonderful. I'm so glad you asked that question, Ryan, because I was going to ask that too. And I really like the idea of having it in writing, as Ray and Vanessa have implied. Something I do in my classes, which has its own strengths, but I think in some ways having it in writing might be an additional component I'll add, is I tend to return papers during conferences. And so I go over the comments with my students. And so that has, one of the nice things about it is it allows them a chance at dialogue. So they can say, I was trying to do this. And you can respond saying, well, it didn't quite work because this sentence didn't lead into that, or whatever it is. But I'm thinking now, for hearing all of you, that if they do it in writing, some students might be a little embarrassed about saying something to my face, in terms of this wasn't very helpful or whatever it is. So it might be helpful to back that up. I think I would still continue that with a written sort of thing like you're implying.
Yeah, and the really great thing about it too is that we started to deploy it, not just, based on the writing, but also like when we deploy a writing workshop, right? As a sort of, not necessarily a way to take attendance, but as a way to sort of check in on them to make sure everything has been understandable. We'll ask them, hey, how was, what are the biggest lessons from this 15-minute session that you can take away? And so we started doing that as well. And it was amazing to see students' responses, because at that point, then they started to say, well, I think if we just had more time to revise or proofread each other's work, it would have been really so much more useful. And so it was a point where then they started offering suggestions, and at that point contributing to the development maybe of the next writing workshop, right? And so it was a tricky situation though, because we had to tell them like well ahead of time and saying like, hey, this is how the class is going to be structured. We want you to be open with us. We want open communication. And, as we all know, it's like pulling teeth during maybe the first 2 weeks, and then they start getting really into the swing of things when they know that the big paper is due. And so that was something that, we thought really worked, and we enjoyed, having that more of a connection with the students at that point. Yeah,
my little piece that I'll say is when I started having students write feedback on their peer response, in part because then when I meet with them, it's not tell me what to do with my paper, but here's what my classmates said, and here's the changes I'm planning to make, and here's the places that I think I need some want you to look at. Like it 100% changed conferences for the better. But I love the idea of adding in feedback on end comments and looking towards like, so what happens with the next paper? What happens if you go back and revise this? I think it's a great idea. I wanted to bring up the way that I think actually probably everybody, now that I'm thinking about it, but certainly some of you very explicitly referenced collaboration and the importance of collaboration, and the importance of the fact that the work that we do is collaborative. I mean, the illusion that teaching is this sort of like solitary gig, and it's really not. It's highly, highly collaborative. And I mean, I'm thinking of Tracy, the way you were talking about working with this, like saying, collaborating with the students, like what's the text we want to use? What are the questions we want to explore? That is, I mean, frankly, if they go on to college, that will happen in their college courses. So to give them that opportunity at the high school level, and for students who have felt disempowered by the entire system, I think is very, very valuable and important. But I was also noticing, Erin, that for you, it was like collaboration was absolutely essential in order to get the larger, school community to like work on this. So I guess I just wanted to give people a moment to talk about the role of collaboration in what you're doing.
I'll just jump in real quick. For me, the whole idea of letting them choose is scary to me. And because I haven't found any books where I could just go, okay, here's some issues in this. I've been looking at websites to learn about certain things going on down here in the San Bernardino area with our local indigenous populations. But that idea of this collaboration and what project to work on is almost carnival-like to me, because I think teachers like to have some sort of sense of control over lessons and teaching and instruction, and having a collaborative project, not only having students choose them, but then working on it sort of on the fly to a certain extent is very carnival-like. And I don't know if that's just me and my crazy way of looking at the world, or if that's a true reflection or a legitimate reflection, So that's it.
Well, I mean, it resituates you, right? So that the expertise that you're bringing to the room is, let me help you work on how to communicate this. And let me help you identify where your purpose is and why this is important. And let me help you turn it into a paragraph that is like, will make sense, and we'll read it and we'll get across your issues and concerns. But there you get to bring in a lot of knowledge and expertise, which is probably very empowering. So
yeah, exactly. Thank you. Yes.
Erin, I really liked how you are trying to get the professors to take pride in teaching writing and not just assigning it, right? Are there disciplines you found or departments that are harder to do that with?
Interesting question. It's really been, I don't know, I don't want to make too many generalizations, but I feel like I've seen a lot of openness in younger faculty versus the older faculty who have been around for a long time and done it this way. And as you saw, the old guidelines that we threw out the window, one of them was you could have a discussion in class. Like that was, who doesn't have a class discussion and like a presentation and write a reflection. So they could really do these really, minimal things and have it be considered writing or rhetoric intensive. So it's been kind of, I don't want to sound ageist, but that's been an issue I've had or who's been around the longest. And this is how it's been going for 15 years. I had a meeting last week with a math and physics together, and that was a trip. But I emphasized to them, because they wanted to do presentations, and I said, that's fine. I just want you to emphasize that, what's the process of that's going to, that students are going through a process, they're getting feedback, it's fine. They have to write something in order to present something. And so it was finding that middle ground a little bit. So that, it's been a little bit discipline specific, and then the math and sciences have been resisting me, or what I want them to do. But then again, biology has been wonderful. So it's, it just depends on kind of who's in that position, who's got that openness. And in a small university, that can be really tricky, because it's kind of, these two people running this one department. I hope one of them finds what I'm trying to get them to do. Okay. But on the flip side of that, the alternative is that if they don't have a rhetoric intensive course in their major, which is something I didn't mention, they have to take the English equivalent, the one offered by the English department, which can lengthen the student's degree. So that's kind of their incentive for the sake of the students to make this work. So I've brought it back to that a few times to convince them that this is for the students, and here's why, that, teaching them writing as a process in a discipline specific way is going to really help them. So not a clear cut answer on who's been doing what, but it's
I was just curious because medical humanities is so big these days. I guess we need physics humanities or some such, which Vanessa seems to be dealing with a lot of this.
Yeah, Yeah, and I want to say I completely empathize with you, Aaron, because I went through the same process, having conversations with the CNAS science departments. I remember distinctly a conversation I had with a physics instructor about the inclusion of a lesson in metaphor, because science tends to use it a lot, like the fabric of space and time, these sort of things.
Right.
And at first they jokingly said, well, it's probably not going to be needed, right? And then down the road, they realize, oh, this can actually help them, because now they have to show an awareness of audience, not just to the scientific community, but also a general audience, right? How do we understand very complex scientific concepts? And that made me think about too, Tracy, about your the play that comes with teaching as well. And you know, and one of my colleagues did this, and I borrowed it. I talked to students as if, you know, like a Dungeons and Dragons kind of game where, you know, the dungeon master and the player team can have a discussion about the rules or the processes, as opposed to just relying on a much more stringent set of rules. So there was that level of flexibility and play there that I really encouraged. So yeah, yay on collaboration. Yeah.
Yeah, just speaking of collaboration, I really, Vanessa, it's nice to see you. It's been a while since the in-person faculty meetings. I think that's the last time I probably saw you. Yeah, the Spatial Sciences Institute, I have a student who's in the Spatial Sciences, and it sounds like a really fascinating program, because she's doing like, you know, geography on the one hand, but then it's like, you know, human geography and that kind of, the geography of LA and like real and imagined places and so forth. I liked your, I guess this is more of a comment than a question, because I just like the way that you were talking about how you work with the students in helping them to make their writing more, and I suppose the Spatial Sciences Program Institute on the whole, understand to audiences not in the spatial sciences, and you were talking about kind of the rhetorical purpose of that. It reminded me of, you know, Peter Elbow's kind of writer-based prose versus the reader-based prose, and the importance of like not necessarily writing with your audience in mind immediately, because that can kind of cripple the writing process, but then to go back through your revision and then to start thinking about the different kinds of audiences that might kind of come across your paper in different settings. So that was just a really cool kind of approach.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of, you know, I kind of stand in for that, you know, in a very supportive and hopefully non-crippling way. I stand in for that person, and you know, am forever curious. Even when I'm not curious, I sort of decide to be deliberately curious about these, you know, really complex projects. But you know, to always, you know, again, because they tend to focus on the technical, and they focus on the method, and they focus on showing off, like, this is the cool tool that I get to use. And I say, like, but no, it's so much more important than just the cool tool. It is, you know, so much bigger and broader than that. And what about this? And this isn't a tradition of this. And so, yeah, I'm always there to sort of push that kind of beyond their kind of, yeah, again, they've been in the school program for quite a while, and they've been in like deep in the coursework trenches. So yeah, I hope to be that person for them. And it's also, you know, spatial sciences is so interesting because I get, you know, humanities people, I get, you know, people making story maps for teaching a history class. So it's not all STEM, you know, but it really, I mean, I think it is ideal for someone working transdisciplinarily because there are so many disciplines, you know, within it. We often like to say, and we along, you know, as though I'm sort of part of them, but, you know, we like to say that it's more of a tool than a discipline, because it's a tool that you can use throughout kind of multiple disciplines.
And I do know that the people who teach in spatial sciences, because I've talked to some of them about it, because they are also teaching faculty, right? They talk about like, well, there was that other research part of my life, which might be very far away from, like, now they're teaching, you know, with what they're teaching now is very much about how to use these tools and how to do this mapping and how to make it legible. So yeah. So I want to thank everybody, and I want to be mindful of your time because we are a little after 7:30. But it has been a lovely conversation. So thank you all for being here and for coming and for staying to the very last. Yes, coming to the very last panel. It has been lovely as always. Thank you,
Yeah.
Shefali, for putting together such a wonderful panel.
Of course. And Norah, thank you for doing such a great job as chair and every one of the speakers today. You guys were awesome. So much to think about and learn. Thank you.
Really great.
Thank you. See you at UCLA next year.
Yes. All right. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.